I was there, staring at those screenshots. A WhatsApp group called The Unbearable Mother-in-Law, where my daughter-in-law Laura posted every little thing I did in my house, twisting my words, laughing at me with her friends. "That nosy old woman has no life," one message read. My hands shook holding my son's phone. He had left it unlocked on the table while he showered. A cold line ran down my spine. How long had they been laughing at me? Was my own son part of it? The Wi-Fi icon in the corner showed my home network, the internet I pay for. I breathed. This humiliation would not stand. Tomorrow I would act. I began to collect the small, quiet signals, like someone reads the weather by the way the curtains tremble. First, the whispers. I would come into a room and the sentence in the air would snap shut. A laugh cut off. A phone tucked lower into a lap. A silence that tasted like someone had swallowed a secret. I felt foolish for noticing at first, like noticing a thread on a sweater that everyone else pretended not to see. I found myself waiting at doorways, listening for the single syllable that would betray them. I heard, "Did you see?" and then a soft click as a screen locked. I heard, "She thinks," and then the clink of a spoon against a cup. Those small noises became a map, where the laughter gathered, where the disrespect lived. They looked at me differently in small acts. Miguel would answer a question with a single word and then check his phone for permission to breathe. Laura would stand at the counter and say, "I'll do it later," while a friend texted her in the next room. The words were soft, the meaning, sharp. I kept my face calm. I kept thinking I was imagining the tilt in their voices. The second signal was the things that moved. Towels slid into new positions. My shampoo bottle was angled so the label faced a camera. A toothbrush swapped sides of the sink. It was the sort of childish rearrangement that makes your skin crawl because it is done with intent. I opened drawers and found them as if someone had curiously pawed through them, not because I was disorganized, but because they had been searching for material to mock. One day the packet of my favorite tea was on the floor in the guest room, empty, the opening neatly folded. Someone had taken a picture of it next to a coffee pod and joked about old lady habits. I put the packet in my pocket. Later, I held it until the smell of bergamot was a memory I could touch. Identity can be a small ritual. When they mocked it, they were picking at the seams of who I was. I tried to name these things to myself without making them larger than they were. I told myself they were jokes, that every generation trades barbs, that perhaps I had become hypersensitive. But the third signal changed the hypothesis into something that could not be amended away. People stopped showing up for the tiny duties of living. The laundry pile grew where it had never grown. My daughter Daniela would bring over a bag and flinch when she saw how much had been left for me to do. Miguel would promise to take out the trash and instead leave the kitchen door slightly ajar so the smell would do the work of a complaint. Laura would stand in the doorway and say, "I would help but I'm running late," and then scroll. The house filled with small neglects. A plant on the balcony leaned toward the sun and nothing went to reclaim it. The kettle sat with a slowly hardening ring of mineral at its bottom because nobody wiped it. The radio played in the corner and went unmoved when I asked for a different station. Their indifference made the rooms chill in ways that had nothing to do with air and everything to do with absence. I remember one day I asked for help preparing the table. It was the sort of thing my mother would have called the smallest courtesy. I set out plates and cutlery, arranged the napkins, and then asked Miguel to bring the salad bowl from the fridge. He sighed like I had asked him to lift a boulder. He pushed past me with eyes that said the meal was inconvenient. Laura laughed at a phone across the room. She did not look up. "Can you at least set the water?" I said, my voice small. She responded with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "We can just get water later, abuela, she said, intentionally using the word to carve distance. The word abuela sounded like a label being test run for a joke. The thing about repeated small indignities is that they act like a slow leak. You patch one with a smile. You patch another with a never mind. You patch a third with the memory of who this person used to be. But the air thinned. My patience, which had been taught as virtue by my mother as a shield, turned brittle. I began to note the timing of their jabs and the choreography behind them. Laura had a habit of posting when the house was empty, then calling Miguel to laugh, their voices low and confident. They debated which of my quirks would be the funniest to share. One afternoon I overheard Laura describing to a friend the way I put my keys on a hook, like she's worshipping them, she said, and laughed in a way that took the warmth out of the room. There was a neighbor who used to greet me with a basket of fruit, simple courtesies that kept the day human. She stopped bringing baskets and instead brought me stories. Once she asked if I had considered talking to Miguel about his priorities. She said it with a softness that hit a blade. I understood how gossip can mutate into pressure. Another micro-conflict came through a public slight. At a family lunch in the plaza, one I had prepared because it was my comfort, Laura loudly asked in front of Andres and Teresa whether I still needed to cook for everybody. The sentence hung like smoke. Daniela flushed. Andres cleared his throat and changed the subject. Teresa gave me a look of pity that was a sheet over her face. My sauce simmered and I realized the meal was a show with me as the unwitting prop. That day, the play of normal life revealed a seam. The laughter was not neutral, it was carving me into an artifact to be displayed and then destroyed. I began to catalog these things like evidence, though I would not have called it that yet. I wrote dates in my head: Thursday, when the note about space was left on my bedside table. Saturday, when the shampoo was angled. Sunday, when Laura said she had it with me at the table. I kept a barrier inside me. I kept the part of me that wanted to confront from speaking because I had spent a lifetime avoiding unnecessary pain. I had been the one to absorb offenses in order to preserve a family image. Now that habit was a chain. The chain felt oddly old-fashioned and heavier every time I went to pick it up. I was not naive to family tensions. There had been storms before. But this felt like a pattern with intent. It was not a lonely insult. It had structure. It had a network. It had, I saw with a brittle clarity, a pattern of coordination, jokes scheduled, photographs taken, momentum built in messages. I rehearsed the conversations I did not want to have. I imagined myself calm, hand folded on the table, voice steady as I explained why respect is not an optional subscription. I practiced everything: what to say, what not to say, the tone that would not escalate into the furious shouting my mother feared. In my rehearsals I was precise and dignified. In life, I found my throat tight as a fist. Laura's gestures started to carry a message beneath them. She would tidy a room with exaggerated care as if to demonstrate that I was incapable. She would move a chair and then take a picture, sending it with a laughing sticker. It was cruelty dressed as domesticity. When cruelty wears the clothes of ordinary life, it is the most difficult to call out. 2 small scenes became the axis of my discomfort. The first took place in the little hallway by my bedroom. I had left my reading glasses on the small table, as I always did. When I returned, they were in the center of a plate, a napkin draped over them like a funeral shroud. On top someone had placed a sticky note: "Who reads these things?" It was childish. It was precise. It was meant to be seen. The second scene happened at night when I could not sleep. I walked into the living room and found Laura and 2 friends on the sofa with laptops open. They were scrolling through pictures I had taken at family gatherings and making captions. One said, This is the look of I would see the room behind the curtain. I stood at the doorway of the kitchen and noticed my reflection in the oven glass. A woman steady, a woman tired, but a woman with hands that had built a life and would not watch it be dismantled without action. Tomorrow, I would look for proof. I could not yet imagine the exact shape of what I would find. But I felt the moment like the raised hand before a bell. The bell would ring and everything would shift. The next morning, the house smelled like coffee and possibility. I had no idea how much it would cost me to pull the thread. I was about to cross the threshold into knowing. The phone on the table did not belong to me, and yet when I held it my entire body recognized the weight of what it carried. I had not planned to look at it again that day. I had meant to put it back and walk away with my dignity folded like a quiet handkerchief. Instead my fingers found the open screen. The wallpaper was a photo of Miguel at some rooftop party, smiling into a light that was not mine. I told myself I would only check the messages to see if I had missed a call. Habit dragged me deeper. The chat titles were small, innocuous icons that made my stomach tighten. La Suegra Insufferable glowed at the top in that bland green that dehumanizes words into a shape. I felt a wave of nausea and a weird clarity. People who name someone like a headline have already decided what they will do to them. I scrolled. At first it was joke snippets of private moments, an emoji, a photo cropped to make a face look ridiculous. The tone was casual, a casualness that is always the most dangerous because it normalizes cruelty. Then came the photos taken without permission. A picture of me asleep in the sofa with a blanket over my shoulders. A picture of me bent over the plants, hair loose. A photo of me leaving the shower with a bathrobe clutched like an umbrella, the image cruel and precise. Someone had captured my private life and put it on display like a specimen under glass. There were captions under the images, bits of text I read and felt like fire on my skin. Would you look at this? Laura wrote in one. She still wears that sweater from the 80s. Priceless. A reply, teach me to get that look, LOL. Miguel chimed in with a small laughing emoji, as if the emoji could hand-wave the act into harmlessness. My fingers shook as I scrolled further. The threads were tagged with names I recognized, friends, relatives, people who had been welcomed into my house to eat my food and then used those moments as entertainment. A friend posted a poll, which of her habits is the worst? People chose, and the poll turned my life into a contest. There were screenshots of things I had said in confidence to my son last December, words meant only for our quiet kitchen. Someone had captured my frustration about money, my worry about the light bill, my small, honest complaints, and turned them into fodder. The messages were merciless in their intimacy. I looked for Miguel's name in the participants list and found it there next to Laura's. My heart pushed against my ribs like a child against a closed door. I found messages from his in-between, WTH, same LOL, small and casual, but they were there. Presence is a form of consent, I thought. Presence is not silence. Presence is a choice. There was a moment, a single message that felt like a blade that made the floor tilt beneath me. Laura had posted a screenshot of my social media profile with laughing faces emblazoned across it and a caption, "Who taught her Facebook? Vintage filters only." Miguel responded with a single line, "She's got no life." The sentence hit me like a cold wind through thin clothing. She's got no life. It was not a remark about what I did, it was an erasure. It said as much as if they had put my existence in small letters and then stepped on it. To hear my own son type that about me was a noise that would not stop. I had done everything for him. I had worked more hours, taken smaller meals, given up vacations, signed forms, appeased, covered, come to the rescue when job offers died. I had given him his diploma in my hands and kissed dust from his collar, and yet here was a sentence that turned every sacrifice into an insult. I remember the way the light fell across my hands. They were the hands I had used to iron shirts for job interviews, to stitch a hem when money was tight, to hold a small body when fevered. The images on the screen made those hands feel foreign. It is strange, an image can make you feel like you are watching yourself in a play you did not audition for. A new message arrived as if on cue. Laura had written, "Goodbye, love. Almost out of here." And then, we got the deposit, Miguel. The laughing faces multiplied. The chat was a nest of small betrayals. My breath came in sharp little balloons. I closed my eyes and saw my living room as if it were a stage filled with actors pretending to be family. They had kept me at center stage and were now building the exit door behind my back. Miguel came into the kitchen and found me with his phone. His face was the color of an overdue bill. "Mama," he said, voice high. I looked at him and felt the weight of 1,000 small concessions collapse into a single block of ice. "Why?" I asked. The question left my mouth not as a soft inquiry but as a strike. I needed a word that was not accusation but demanded truth. He stammered. Mom, it was a joke. We were just what?" I said. The dinner plate of rehearsed calm in my hands fell. The room filled with a noise I could not name, the kitchen clock, the hum of the fridge, the low pulse of their laughter in my head. He tried again to explain, his hands flapping like someone trying to wave away smoke. "It's not what you think. Laura sent a picture, and you were there," I finished for him, the sentence a small, exact blade. He looked then at Laura, who had come into the doorway, pretending the photo was an accident captured by the camera's timer. She had makeup a little smudged from crying in a performance designed to buy her defense. She took a breath and smiled, a smile whose edges were obvious from a stage. "I didn't know she would take it so seriously," she said in a voice that sounded like she had been coached. "It was a joke, Gloria. You have to admit you can be a little, well, endearing in a very old-fashioned way." The word, endearing, tasted like vinegar. She had framed me like a quaint curiosity, something to be exhibited and then sympathized with. Sympathy is another form of control. My throat closed. The room had suddenly become composed of two types of people, those who will say sorry and mean it, and those whose sorry is a soft thing they toss like a garnish. I wanted to name who was who. Miguel's face crumpled into guilt. For a moment he looked young and small. He reached out as if to touch my arm and then stopped, unsure if his touch would push me back or break me. It was dumb. "I didn't think," he said, the words brittle and immediate. There was a real note of regret in them. But regret without accountability feels like a band-aid on an open wound. I picked up the phone where it had been abandoned. I tapped on a photo and found a thread of messages where they had scheduled the jokes, who would post when, which photo would get the biggest reaction. People had called it the roast and planned a time like you plan a party. They had invited friends of theirs who had visited the house, shared meals at my table, used my towels, and they had all joined in. An image of me in my bathrobe taken without knocking on a bathroom door was marked with a laughing sticker. There were messages from Laura's friends saying, "OMG, she looks like she could be my aunt," followed by crying with laughter emojis. My privacy had been violated in a small, intimate way and then amplified into a public spectacle. I remember standing up and feeling my knees lock for a second. It was like stepping off a curb into deep water and realizing you can still swim. I had always told myself I would rise to protect my dignity, but until that moment dignity had been an idea and now it demanded action. I put the phone down lightly on the table, as if it were glass that might shatter. I told Miguel to sit. You have been sharing pictures of me, I said. The sentence was small. The implication was not. He admitted it, but I knew the real work would be a quieter, more difficult thing: proof. Documents. Facts. A record that could not be waved away as a misunderstanding. I pulled my laptop to my knees and opened a blank document. I began to type a list. Date. Photo. Caption. Participant. I wrote down everything I saw. I took notes like a woman cataloging plants, a botanist making a specimen list. I photographed the images on Miguel's phone with my own device and saved them in a folder labeled, simply, Evidence. My hands did not shake when I did it. There was a steadiness I had not known I possessed. For years my energy had been poured into a house that ran on my insistence. I had built a life from order and timetables and small mercies. Now I was taking that order and turning it into something that could stand on its own, facts. I thought of what Antonia would say. She had a lawyer's eyes, crisp, pragmatic. She would tell me to document, to keep calm, to not make threats I could not back up. She would tell me that dignity is honored in steps, not screams. I made a mental note to call her. I also thought about the small ways one protects oneself: change passwords, consult the bank about transfers, keep keys close, never leave the house unlocked to men who have shown they will turn your privacy into a punchline. I breathed in. For the first time since I had seen the first messages, I felt not only betrayal, but a trajectory. Betrayal is a thing you stumble in, action requires planning. I saved the folder and closed the laptop. The night in the house felt quieter because I had made a shape of what had been shapeless. The pain was still there, a raw thing, but it had edges. I slept that night with the light on. I woke at dawn with the feeling that the scales had been tipped and something would tip back. Tomorrow I would start to gather more than images. I would count the receipts, the transfers, the nights when I had bought groceries for people who then made a joke of me. I would make lists that a lawyer could understand. The day after that, I would speak. I was no longer only hurt. I was aligning the evidence with the truth. The phone felt like a small, terrible bridge between what I had been and what I would become. The morning light came through the curtains like a slow question. I had not slept much. My head felt full of glass beads, each thought clinking against the next. I made tea, small and exact, the way my mother taught me, 2 spoons, not 3, and sipped it like a priest before a ritual. The house smelled of lemon and paper because I had printed the first set of screenshots and receipts the night before and left them on the kitchen table like an accusation waiting to be read. I called Antonia before the coffee had fully cooled. Her voice was the voice of someone who had seen many human catalogs of error: divorce papers, tenant disputes, probate fights. She asked me calm questions. Had I saved the images? Had I backed them up? Did I want to file a complaint? She listened to the chronology I offered and then outlined a plan with the kind of economy that stripped emotion into steps. Document everything, she said. Print receipts, list transfers, note dates. If you want to take legal steps, you need a file that is chronological and airtight. I don't want to humiliate them, I said, the phrase a small animal finding refuge in my mouth. You won't humiliate them, she replied. You will protect yourself. Humiliation is what they chose for you. Her clarity was a salve. She told me to gather bank statements where I could prove I had covered the utilities and the grocery transfers to Miguel's account, and to get copies of any relevant messages. She said we would draft a letter that was firm but not vengeful, a legal notice that offered them time and options but made clear there were next steps if they refused. After I hung up, I went to the desk where the folder of prints lay like a case. I held an image of the screenshot that said, "She's got no life." The sentence wanted to be a barb, but in my hands it was just a sentence someone else had written. I began to catalog the money I had spent for them. The list surprised me because it had been hidden in plain sight. A transfer here for a deposit, a $1,000 for a sudden repair billed by Miguel as Dad's old heater acting up, groceries that were always purchased and never paid back. I tallied months of small transfers and the larger sums, and I felt both foolish and furious. How could I have sheltered this part of my life from being recorded and then used as evidence of burden? It is a strange thing to count the cost of kindness. It is a stranger thing to do it with the clarity that may become the base of your case. I wrote numbers in a column and each one became a line in the ledger of what I had given. I printed bank statements and highlighted the transfers in yellow like someone making wheat into bread. I made a copy of the deed to the house and placed it beside the folder like a shield. It said in black and white what had been invisible to gossip. The house was mine. The law would say that simply. But the law would not mend a broken trust. The law would only mark boundaries. That afternoon I called the internet provider. I remember the sound of the phone operator's voice, warm and practiced, and then the clack of keys as they accessed my account. "Yes, ma'am," they said. "We can change the password and establish a schedule. You can limit access to certain MAC addresses and set hours. Would you like me to send a technician?" "Yes," I said, because the idea of them laughing behind the shield of my router felt obscene. "Yes, I need it secured." I scheduled the visit for the next morning. It felt small and practical and fierce, cutting off the stream of jokes in the place where they had incubated. They had relied on my generosity for laughter and connection, and I would now use the same tools to set boundaries. The router would become a gate. I thought of my keys and decided to collect the spare ones from where I had left them ages ago on a little dish by the door. I put them in my purse. It was a trivial gesture in the scheme of it, but it felt like a reclaiming. I had been a house that gives keys. I would be a house that holds them. I also began to build a mental script for what I would say when I asked them to leave or to pay rent, words that were not full of vindictiveness but clear and unarguable. I rehearsed in the living room. "You have 2 weeks," I would say. "During those 2 weeks you will pay your share of utilities and buy your own groceries. After that, if you choose to stay, we will have a rental agreement." I placed the words in my mouth as if tasting them. They felt strong and fair. The point was not to punish, the point was to align my home with the dignity I had been practicing to hold. The words were the hinge. In the evening I spoke to Daniela. Her voice on the phone was immediate and sharp and full of the protective thing a sister has when she sees harm. She said she would come over. "Don't do anything dramatic without me," she said. "We should be measured. We should be precise. And bring the evidence." When she arrived, she hugged me the way someone folds around an injured thing without squeezing too hard. She sat at the table and we arranged the prints into piles. There was the social media pile, the bank transfers pile, the dates of incidents pile. We made a timeline that could be read like a story, small humiliations escalating into a coordinated campaign and the money trail that had paid for some of their comfort. Daniela's eyes grew wet when she saw the list of transfers that had been denominated as gifts. She put her hand on mine and said, "How did he think this was okay?" I could not answer because the question was not about logic but about the slow erosion that betrayal does. It is a particular cruelty when your generosity is repackaged as evidence you are expendable. It twists the story of affection into proof of weakness. We called Antonia and she told us the letter she would prepare. We decided to wait until the technician had secured the router and until I had a more complete list of the expenses. We would give Miguel and Laura a choice, either sign a small rental agreement with clear responsibilities, or begin the steps to find another place. The law allowed a written notice and a reasonable time. Antonia suggested 2 weeks. The letter would be firm and unemotional. That night, I laid the prints on the kitchen table and looked at them as if they were artifacts in a museum case. Each one told. The moment was small and technical, but when the last device lost access, the room felt like a ship that had lost its open gangway. "Why are you doing this?" Miguel asked when he checked his phone and found only spinning circles. His voice was the voice of someone realizing an easy comfort had been removed. "Because this house is my home," I said. The sentence fell like a plate. There was no drama, only practicality. He fumbled. Laura watched with a face I no longer recognized. She had the look of someone who had been surprised by consequence. I thought about how many nights they had sat in the glow of the devices in rooms I had kept, their laughter amplified by the network I paid for. They had used my generosity as a stage. The day I planned to give them the notice, I practiced the speech in my head. I would be calm. I would be clear. I would not let the room be turned into a theater of guilt. I had my folder, my prints, the bank statements, and Antonia on the phone if needed. I felt like a woman gathering tools for a measured job. When they arrived in the living room that evening, they had the tired faces of people who had not slept well. Perhaps their fatigue had been because of guilt. Perhaps they were tired from the pretense. Either way, they looked at me for the woman I used to be and did not have the courage to look deeper. I set the folder down on the table and pushed it toward them. "I am not asking for apologies as theater," I said. "I am asking for a change in behavior and for respect. You have 2 weeks." Silence fell like an answering machine. Laura exhaled and tried to make a joke into a salve. Miguel apologized the way people do when they are not ready to change, quickly, with the hope that the next inconvenience will wash it away. I told them the conditions: pay your part of the utilities for the last 3 months, reimburse for the transfers that were used as their expenses, and if you choose to stay, we will have a rental agreement signed and notarized. If not, you have 2 weeks to find a place. "You're kicking us out," Laura said, a tremor she tried to hide. "I am offering you choices," I replied. "Choices are how adults live." Miguel stood and left the room. He touched my shoulder as he passed and his hand was hesitant and small. I did not flinch. Later that night I sat in the garden and felt the air cool around me. The plants rustled as if the world was saying, at last, something true. I repeated an old line of my mother's that had been a lullaby and a doctrine: dignity is not borrowed. It is kept. I had not yet won anything. I had made moves and set boundaries. But there is power in a boundary that is well laid and legally clear. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Miguel began to contribute small amounts to the account he once used for transfers. Laura removed some of the social posts I had seen. They moved boxes when their eyes met mine differently. There were no dramatic scenes, only the slow, strange recalibration of a household learning new rules. Sometimes the courage to set a limit is more revolutionary than any shout. The world will call it cold or hard, and perhaps it is. But when you are 5'8" and have been given little but the work of love, you learn that boundaries are the grammar of respect. The house began to breathe differently. I would not say I forgave them that month. Forgiveness is a long road that requires evidence of change. But I would say I reclaimed my life in increments, the router as a gate, the printed proofs as a ledger of truth, the legal letter as a marker on the path. Each one was a small reclamation. And in the evenings, when the city lights blinked and I sat at my table with a cup of tea, I would look at the empty chair across from me and not feel absurd. I felt a clarity I had not known. I had stepped from silence into action, and the world around me had to rearrange. A woman can be tender and firm. She can hold the dinner plates and the documents. She can make lists and love. She can be both keeper of a house and keeper of her right to be seen. I learned it in the hard geography of betrayal. The question I leave you with is one I ask myself sometimes as I fold the laundry now slowly, proudly. How many things in your life are you paying for with kindness, and at what point do you stop being a home and start being a stage? I took my tea and watched the street. The router blinked a slow blue. The house, at last, seemed to listen. I had stood up. I had not shouted. I had started to fix what they had broken. I felt a small, steady calm settle into my chest like a hand smoothing a tablecloth. The shock had done its work. Now the work I had to do felt like ordinary housekeeping. I moved as if I were arranging plates, practical, exact, deliberate. I began with the papers. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the old accordion folder where I keep receipts and warranties. The manila folders smelled faintly of lemon oil and old ink. I spread them on the kitchen table under the lamp and let their edges catch the light like small flags. I touched each paper before I sorted it, a tactile promise I was making to myself: you will not be erased. I made a list on the first page of a blank notebook. Date. Item. Amount. Who benefited. Short sentences. My handwriting, which had gotten sloppier in the years of juggling shifts and bills, grew steadier as the numbers appeared. 2 transfers to Miguel labeled emergency in the last 18 months. An electronic receipt for a deposit. Repeated payments for utilities in the joint account that I had paid because it was easier. Each line was a small, honest confession. There is a peculiar dignity in cataloging your own generosity. When you write it down, it becomes something that can be carried with both hands. I printed out bank statements that covered 3 years. The printer whirred and coughed like an old friend, and I fed it paper like I was feeding a ledger of truth. Each page had highlighted lines. I circled sums with a blue pen and underlined repeating entries. The numbers looked smaller in print but meant the same weight. They were proof, not accusations. Proof is a discipline. Proof is patience dressed in ink. I saved the screenshots I had taken from Miguel's phone into a folder named Evidence. I copied that folder to a small external drive and to a secure cloud account I had rarely used. I labeled the files with dates and brief notes. Bathrobe photo posted March 3rd, poll comments mocking my cooking April 21st. I made sure each file had a timestamp that matched my notes. The idea was simple: if anyone tried to say, it was a joke, or, you misread it, the documents would speak differently. I called Antonia and asked her to meet that afternoon. Her voice, efficient and soft at once, asked the essential questions. Did I want mediation? Did I want an eviction notice? Did I want a contract? She suggested steps and cautions that felt like the measured lights of a lighthouse. She said, we build a file. We make it chronological. We are careful with language. That was her way of saying we will not let emotion play lawyer. It was the precise comfort I needed. 2 weeks is reasonable, she said after I told her how I wanted to proceed. It is a fair notice, and it looks good on paper. But you must be prepared to enforce it. The sentence was crisp. It landed like a hinge closing. At home I made copies of the deed to the house and put them beside the receipts. The deed rested like a commandment in black and white: this house is yours. The law is not a balm for betrayal, but it is a necessary border. I slipped a copy into my notebook and put the original back in the drawer behind an old sweater. I held the paper for a moment and felt the ordinary weight of it, the same weight that had kept the house upright while I worked nights and saved lunches. Then the small practicalities. I called the internet company again, this time with a list. I asked for steps in writing. I told them I would schedule a technician to come change the password and set device restrictions. The man on the other end gave me a checklist and a time window. He asked a few questions that made me realize how often I had been invisible. Had I ever set an admin password? Had I ever I gathered the spares, the car keys, the garage opener, the small brass key to the garden gate. I moved them into my purse. It was a small theft of power, but it felt necessary. Keys are promises that someone will be let in, taken back. They are promises claused. I spoke with the bank twice more. The first time I confirmed that only I had signatory authorization on the major accounts. The second time I asked about how to document the transfers I had made to Miguel's account. The bank clerk suggested I request an official printout of outgoing transfers with notes. He also told me, gently, that while showing transfers does not automatically mean repayment, the records do make a persuasive case if a mediated agreement or legal claim becomes necessary. He used the word persuasive as if it were a delicate spice. I appreciated the culinary metaphor. A difficult, deliberate part of the preparation was deciding what I wanted from the conversation I would have with Miguel and Laura. This required imagination and restraint. I knew I could scream until my voice was raw. I knew I could throw the phone on the table and fling the printed screenshots like a deck of cards. Both things would feel good in the moment and worthless afterwards. I wanted outcomes. I made a list of possible outcomes and the steps to reach each one. Option A: they accept the rental terms, we sign a legal rental agreement, it is notarized, they pay deposit and utilities, and we move forward with defined boundaries. Option B: they cannot or will not comply, they move out within 2 weeks, I document departure and sign off, I adjust my accounts and rebalance the home. Option C: they lie, resist, or attempt to manipulate, I proceed with legal channels, which Antonia would advise. Each option had a set of small actions attached, like an ingredients list. The list calmed me. I wrote the notice. Antonia had offered a draft and I sat with it like a woman ironing out a stubborn wrinkle. The notice was plain. It stated the facts, the expectation, and the timeline. It included the phrase, reasonable time, and then defined what that meant, 14 days. It noted the proof I had compiled and requested either a formal rental agreement or an agreed plan for departure. The sentence that might have been a scold read instead like a border, these are the conditions under which you may remain in this house. I printed the notice and tucked it into the green folder with all the other prints. I practiced reading that notice aloud in the living room. My voice shook the first 2 times. The third time it did not. I practiced the pauses. There are small legal pauses that make an argument sound less like anger and more like authority. I practiced the line I knew would sting if it came, you have 2 weeks. I tasted those words in my mouth like a medicine I intended to take. I told Daniela everything. She held my hands and her fingers were small and hot. She said she would be there for support. She asked practical questions about where Miguel might go, which landlord they could call, if I wanted the police present at the moment of enforcement. I said no to the police, my fight was not a spectacle. I wanted to be precise, and I wanted whatever it took to leave the dignity intact. She nodded and we made a plan for her to be available by phone and to come if needed. I asked her to wait outside until I asked her to enter. That way, the conversation stayed between me and them first. Antonia suggested I prepare a list of house rules as a contingency. It was not theatrical, it was simple logistics: food, laundry, cleaning, guests, overnight parking. The rules were practical scaffolds for living under one roof. I wrote them in a careful hand and put them in the folder, too. Small armor is still armor. I found comfort in the preparation because it was action in place of betrayal. There were other small scenes of readiness that felt almost private rituals. I washed 2 sets of sheets and left them folded in the guest room, ready to make the bed if the space had to be used differently. I moved a few of my favorite cookbooks to the lower shelf of the kitchen, the ones that smelled like masa and heat. I scheduled the technician to return the day after I planned to give the notice, just in case more technical barriers were required. I made sure my phone was charged and my contacts were at the top of the screen. On the evening before the meeting, I cleaned the living room. I placed the green folder in the center of the table. The lamp made the papers glow. The house smelled faintly of lemon and the burned edge of a match from the candle I had lit earlier. I brewed a small pot of tea and drank it slowly, as if the tea were itself a small treaty between my past self and my future one. I rehearsed the words I would say in the simplest way: calm, factual, firm. Not a sermon. Not a demand for humiliation. A statement of boundaries and options. The sentences sat in my mouth like simple tools. My hands did not tremble when I folded the printed notice and placed it in the envelope addressed to them. I wrote the date on it. I sealed it. For the first time since the phone and the photographs, I slept with a sense of ordered purpose. The morning of the meeting came like any other. The light through the curtains was pale and honest. I put on a blouse I liked, but that did not shout. I arranged my hair. I took a breath like a bell being rung. I felt the quiet of someone who has done the work of setting their house in order. I carried the green folder to the table. When Miguel texted to say he and Laura would be home by 7, I looked at the clock and felt neither triumph nor fear. I felt a clean, legal kind of responsibility. I opened the door to the living room and sat. I placed the folder on the table like a small, solid island. I kept my hands on my lap. I waited. They arrived with the smell of coffee and early excuses. They had rehearsed a small apology or maybe a performance. Their faces were made for negotiation. I stood and took my place at the head of the table. I felt the weight of the folder and the quiet in my bones. I was ready to speak. But readiness is not the same as certainty. There is always the moment before you open your mouth when you wonder if the other person will change. I looked at them and, for a second, the house felt enormous. Then I opened the folder and pulled out the first page. The green folder sat between us like a small, unflinching witness. Its corners were soft from being handled, its contents were uncompromising. I placed a printout of the bank statement first, then a chronological list, then the screenshots. The lamp made the paper edges shine. "Thank you for coming," I said. My voice was calm and the sentence was true. I had invited them. I had given them a fair hour to arrive. The courtesy of punctuality matters when you plan to speak plainly. Miguel's eyes flicked to the folder and then slid away like a man who has found a medicine he must swallow. Laura's jaw worked very subtly, like an animal deciding whether to sprint. There was a quiet I had not heard at our table in months. It was the quiet of a family that knows something delicate is about to be said. I started with facts. Last night I found a group on Miguel's phone. Screenshots were posted. Photos were shared without my permission. There are comments. I pushed the first print across the table so they could see the messages. Their faces registered the images, the photo of me in my robe, the laugh emojis, the poll asking which of my habits was the funniest. There were no explosions in the room, a different kind of thunder had fallen. Laura's voice tried to be light. "It was a joke," she said, the cadence like someone pulling a bandage off slowly. "We didn't mean." She looked at Miguel and he looked small. The sentence trembled. When cruelty is wrapped in the word joke, it is often an invitation to minimize the victim's pain. "It was not a joke for me," I replied, coolly. "It was a violation." The word filled the air like rain. I laid out the financial pages next. The transfers, the highlighted amounts, The rent payments I had made sacrosanct in my head because I had seen them as support, as giving. I read the numbers aloud. 50,000 pesos here. Monthly utilities there. I did this for you because I wanted to help. I explained the legal pathway only as a neutral instrument. Option 1, we formalize your presence here through a rental agreement. You pay a deposit. You pay utilities from the 1st of next month. We sign, notarize, and we live by the rules I will provide. Option 2, you have 2 weeks to find another place. You leave the house in good order. If you do not comply, I will proceed with legal notice. I did not wag my finger. I stated conditions as if I were a steward of the home, which I was. Laura laughed a thin, trying sound. You're kicking us out, she said, as if the world had turned and made her the injured party. The phrase was a kind of theater, cast the elder as unkind and you may divert attention from your own conduct. I am offering you choices, I said, and I let my voice hold the weight of consequence. Choices are for adults. Miguel reached for my hand, a small, awkward movement. Mom, it was a stupid thing. We were joking. We didn't think it would hurt you like this. His voice broke on the last phrase. There was a rawness there. It was not a full apology. Apologies that come too quickly sometimes aim to erase responsibility rather than repair. I nodded because I understood the human shape of regret. If you truly were joking, I said quietly, then why did you plan it? Why make a schedule? Why invite friends who have been in my home and used my things? I looked at Laura and then at Miguel. Planning makes it intent. Laura's face changed in small increments as the room kept moving with logical steps. First disbelief. Then annoyance. Then a thin line of calculation. She moved into defense. We were venting, she said, lowering her voice in a way that invited sympathy. We were frustrated. The subtext was, justify the meanness by the pressure. Frustration legitimizes unkindness in the mouths of those who feel entitled. Venting does not need to be violent, I said. Frustration does not grant permission to hurt. The sentence was short. It was meant to be a fulcrum. There were faces in the house then that had not known. Daniela had come in without drama. She sat by the window with a tea mug and watched like an ally waiting for signal. Her presence mattered more than any speech. Support is not noise, it is ballast. The conversation circled into the practicalities of the rentals and the finances. I showed the draft of the rental contract Antonia had prepared. It was reasonable, a term, an amount, a deposit, responsibilities for utilities, a clause about respecting privacy and not taking images without permission, and a mediation clause for disputes. The clause about privacy had a legal phrase that mattered. Unauthorized recording or dissemination of images would be grounds for immediate termination of the lease. When Laura read that line, she looked at Miguel. Her fingers found the rim of her glass and clenched. Why don't we sign this? I asked. If you want to stay, sign this and comply. Laura's response was immediate and theatrical. We don't have the money for a deposit like that, she said. We were saving for an engagement. Miguel looked chastened. He started counting on his fingers. I watched him add and subtract invisible numbers in his head. I wondered how long he had rehearsed these small evasions. They were predictable human things, the stutter of a person who had equated my silence with indefinite generosity. I made a decision then, precise and practical. If you genuinely cannot afford a deposit, I said, you will be required to show the bank statements of your savings and to contribute proportionally to utilities starting now. Also, while you are here, you will buy your own food. No more, we will eat what is left. No more, we will take a little extra. The rules may have seemed mundane. They were boundaries dressed as chores. Miguel swallowed. He said, "Okay. We can do that." But his "okay" felt like a child's promise. Laura's next move was strategic and personal. She tried to shift sympathy not by owning her actions but by attacking me. "You can be so difficult, Gloria. You make everything so heavy." It was a tactic I had seen before. If a woman, especially an older woman, is presented as cold, the world will sometimes take the side of comfort rather than truth. I met her look without softening. "My age is not your excuse," I said. "My boundaries are not drama. They are necessary." The words were simple and I felt them clamp into place like a new hinge in my chest. At one point the room threatened to splinter into accusation. Miguel stood and paced a little, the room's small measures suddenly too tight for him. He looked older and at the same time smaller. He said, "Mom, we never meant you harm. Please, it was meant to be funny." I could see he meant it. There was real regret in him. But meaning and effect are different currencies. I offered a way forward if they chose it. We would sign the rental agreement, the deposit could be structured in installments, they would begin to pay utilities immediately, contributions to the grocery list, and they would remove any offending posts. They would also issue public apologies to those they had included in the group. I said, public, because humiliation had been public. They looked at that as if the word itself might be an acid. Laura said, "Public apologies are humiliating." Her voice trembled between representing indignation and representing fear. Her performance teetered. "Do you want me to keep it private so we can get over it quietly?" she asked. "No," I said. This was not private. There was no relish in the sentence. There was only clarity. They wanted to bargain. They wanted me to take the whisper, the under-the-breath repentance that would let them keep the shelter without the obligation. I refused. I had learned something about how I had given away my life in small chapters and watched as my gestures were repackaged for amusement. I would not let that cycle continue. After negotiation long, slow, testing each other's language, Miguel agreed to the terms with his voice small and steady. Laura hesitated longer. She asked for time to think. I gave her 24 hours to consider the formal rental. I wrote the options on a spare page and slid it across. The room held the sentence like a stone. When they left the living room, the air felt awkward and rearranged. Miguel touched my shoulder briefly, searching for pardon in a touch. I held his hand but did not embrace him. That small physical restraint was its own kind of lesson. The days that followed were procedural and honest. Miguel began to transfer small amounts to a new sub-account that Antonia suggested. He texted receipts and I checked them against the ledger. Laura removed several of the offending posts, though a few friends had already taken screenshots and shared them elsewhere. Apologies could be messy when the echoes are loud. I kept a list of removed posts and the dates they were removed. Proof, again, is patient. They did not sign the rental agreement the first day. They argued about how to restructure the deposit. There were heated whispers that grazed the edge of shouting. I sat at the kitchen table and read my notes. I watched the calendar. The 2-week mark came into view like a tide. The day the 2 weeks ended, there was a small bell of policy in my chest. I had done what I said I would do. I had been firm and offered choices that would preserve dignity on both sides. I had not sought to humiliate. I had set terms. They had not met them. Miguel and Laura began to pack. They moved boxes with an air of quiet shame. They loaded bags without much ceremony and they left the house without drama. The bed in their room was stripped and the mattress was made with the sheets I had washed and folded the week before. They left behind a few mugs and a single plant that had been watered irregularly. I watched them carry their lives out the door and felt a strange double sensation, one of loss and one of a space returning to its original furniture. Some neighbors watched from their windows. The woman in 3B. I had kept mine and, in doing so, I had asked others to step into a different kind of adulthood. They left. The house listened. 3 months folded themselves into the calendar like pages turned gently. The house settled into a quieter rhythm as if releasing held breath. The small differences became the measure of my days. I began mornings without counting if the kettle would be sufficient for 5. I woke and chose my own coffee, not the brand someone else preferred. I cooked meals for myself and for Daniela when she came. Sometimes I made chilaquiles simply because I wanted them rather than because a crowd expected them. That was a small, private pleasure that felt like reclaiming territory. My economy healed in patient increments. The transfers that once stretched a thin pension began to recede. I watched the balance in my accounts with a new attention, like someone learning to read a map they had always relied on secondhand. Little shifts, fewer nights buying food for guests that would not contribute. A stop to the automatic outflow meant I had more for the doctor visits, more for a small class at the community center, a new pair of shoes that did not squeak. Daniela came often. We sat in the garden and tended the succulents and trimmed dead leaves. She told me how she had felt when she found out, and how she had wanted to storm in but also to let me lead. Her support was tender and practical. We talked about boundaries and about the odd relief of being forced to name hurt. Naming it makes it less like a ghost and more like a wound you can bandage. Our relationship shifted in ways that were honest and adult. Sometimes Miguel texted. His messages were brief and careful. "How are you, Mom?" he'd ask, or, "I wanted to say I'm sorry again." I responded in small, careful ways. "I'm okay," I would write. "Let's talk another time." Those offhand messages were not the same as the closeness we once had. They were reparative threads, not the tapestry. Miguel called once to invite me to his new apartment. He was nervous. He had painted one wall blue, which he admitted was a daring color. I told him I would like to see his place eventually but that I wanted time. He understood. Time is sometimes the necessary currency. Apology must have room to breathe and to be tested by behavior. Laura sent a birthday card with a brief, curated message. It said the right things and was signed with a flourish. I accepted it for what it was, a gesture in the currency she knew. I did not write back. Some things require patience before tenderness. Antonia, in her usual efficient way, had walked me through closing the few loose threads, sending the official letter, filing a note for the record. She had been careful to keep the language neutral and strong. She told me to join the reading group at the cultural center and to meet other women who had stories like mine. "You don't need to come to war," she'd said, "but you can stay in company." So I went to the group on Tuesday nights. We read and we talked. There were women there who had established boundaries with adult children, women who had navigated estates and divorces, women who laughed and then cried about small, long hurts. I learned that my story had edges in common with many others, the same small betrayals, the same erosion. There is comfort in shared geometry. I had one awkward encounter with Laura's mother a month after the move. I ran into her at the little corner bodega where I buy limes for my tea. She saw me and her face did a small, polite contortion between apology and embarrassment. We exchanged pleasantries about the weather, about the city's heat, about the old woman 2 blocks down who had the loudest television. It was public and small. I did not mention the group. There was no benefit in reopening a wound as a lesson to someone else. My dignity did not depend on making others feel small. The house had begun to breathe in a kinder rhythm. I arranged the living room the way I liked it. I added a small armchair near the window for reading. The chair became a place of quiet that was mine. I named the plants I had saved after times in my life. A fern by the sink was Manuel's patience. A small cactus on the windowsill was my mother's steady chin. Giving things names is a way to keep memory patient and human. Financially, the differences showed in small practical ways. My water bill had gone down. The internet bill, once shared and diffused, was now a clear line item with only my devices registered. It was a symbolic relief more than an economic revolution. But I noticed the quiet lift in my shoulders when I checked the accounts and saw less friction. The community around me had shifted, too. Some neighbors who had once been casual acquaintances became friends. Elena from across the hall, the woman with the succulents, brought over a jar of candied figs. We drank tea and she told me stories about her late husband and the stubbornness of pigeons. Small, ordinary trade of life became the currency of healing. The family was not whole in the way it had been. There were long, quiet absences in conversation. Miguel and I texted infrequently. Our chats were short and polite. But there was a new honesty in them that had not been present before my making of boundaries. He was learning that my love did not mean permission to hurt me. That lesson costs, and the cost was his inward work. Sometimes I would catch myself replaying the moment I found the messages. The memory did not sting like a fresh cut anymore. It was a scar that taught me the edges of my own courage. I had been silent and then not silent. I had been hurt and then organized my hurt into action. There is a certain hard, quiet joy in that sequence. Friends of mine started to say small things. Good for you, you did the right thing, we always knew you were stronger than you let on. Their words were generous but unnecessary. I did not do it for praise. I did it because my home, the place where I rest my head at night, deserved to be mine in more than legal paper. It deserved respect. Once, while watering the garden, I thought of the question I always asked myself at the kitchen table. How many Wi-Fi's are you paying for others to make you a joke? The question felt less sharp now. I knew the answer in my own life. I had paid many invisible bills in the currency of silence. I began to teach a small class at the local center about home budgeting and basic contracts. It surprised me, but it felt right. There is a practical tenderness in teaching others how to name numbers and how to read agreements. In the first session, a woman raised her hand and said, "I never realized my generosity could be a ledger." The room hummed. We made lists. We wrote down rules. We practiced saying no in small phrases. The class was not a revolution, it was a tool chest. Sometimes at night I would sit at the window and watch the street. The city has a way of blinking in a light that makes you feel both small and significant. I would think about Manuel and his steady hands, about my mother and her lines about dignity. I would fold laundry slowly, the way people pray. There is prayer in repetition. There is dignity in the way you fold a shirt. If you listen closely, the end of a chapter is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet click of a lock. Sometimes it is the low blue pulse of a router that now serves only those you choose. Sometimes it is the sound of someone taking their tea in the morning without accounting for anyone else's approval. I miss some things. I miss the youthful warmth of Miguel before entitlement cooled him. I miss the easy laughter at family gatherings when it was kind instead of sharp. Those absences are not petty, they are realistic impressions on the map of my life. Time and small acts will heal or at least smooth the edges. I learned to answer invitations on my terms. I attended Miguel's small housewarming by sending a thoughtful dish and a note, not my presence. It was an act of love calibrated to my edges. He understood, and he did not resent the note. Distance can be a salve when it is chosen rather than imposed. At night now, when I fold laundry, I whisper a small question to myself that has become a ritual. I ask, how many Wi-Fis are you paying for others to make you a joke? It is a way to test the air of my life. It is a measuring stick